So let's look at some further considerations on this question of the Trumpian takeover, which is sort of. So one version of a tyrant would be that most people hate the person, so that we could consider a tyrant. And then the democratic system has this um, one special benefit that if there's regular elections, then you should be able to vote the tyrant out. Although the problem is the other sense of what a tyrant is somebody who's taken over the legal system so that he could get around doing that. So, for instance, that was almost, in a way, that's how Vance leapt in, because he said if he were in Mike Pence's place when the electoral delegates came in with the vote that the claimed was suspect, that there could have been, Vance would have upheld that there should have been I forget, they had some word for it, but it's like there should have been a second tier of electors, which is to say something along the lines of that the Republican Party would sort of double check for the election result, and then if they thought there was something afoul, they would either demand a recount, or if they counted and it was in their favor, they would send their own electors to counter the first electors, something like that. But in other words, the way it would happen is through a kind of slippery slope into legal difficulties, which on the surface sort of couldn't be, readily rejected as just outrageous. They would have some kind of sense to them, and so there we have sort of a example of that with this September 8th case to stay or put a stop to this injunction from a federal court against how do they call it? They call it sort of like roving groups. They use the word roving groups of agents is how they refer to it. In terms of ICE agents' right to the language they use is something like it has to be particular without particularized reasonable suspicion. So they have to have a reasonable suspicion, but then what they're saying is too many rights will be violated through some kind of blanket thing along the line of this person starts speaking Spanish, this person appears to be South American or Hispanic, Guatemalan, I think, is one of the big groups they've been deporting a lot of. And then say you have so those are two sort of generalized kind of forbidden categories of so-called reason, even though they are straightforwardly reasonable suspicion machines in a way, and sort of correspond probably to some kind of immediate bias or profiling. Just remembering the simple sort of argument that profiling may be stereotyping, but stereotyping works within the bell curve. So it's like most of the time stereotyping kind of works. It's true that you could assume that a Spanish speaker with a certain look were sort of had Mexican or South American ancestors, and then find out, oh no, they're from Milan or someplace. But that would just be sort of a greater sensitivity of the stereotyping in a way. But we all rely on that kind of thing, and most of the time it's accurate. But this is so in this sense, what I'm saying is this stereotyping is actually a form of reasonable suspicion if you just go straightforwardly. And then they're saying, but you can't do that because it would lead to too many people's rights being violated as being being these roving groups of ICE agents would be again and again, probably multiple times, arresting and arresting in the sense of stopping and not allowing, and then sort of imprisoning in the theoretical sense, as it were, that you can't move off this spot. And subjecting them to unpleasantness in some sense, again and again and again. And then the other two they gave, I think, were, I'll attach the article for people that want to see the details in more reliable form. But I think they were, that there's there's places where people go to wait for manual labor work in morning sometimes. So that would be, just to have a spot like that, even though it is it is reasonable to say to think you would find some people there, but nonetheless it would subject a lot of people falsely to the all these harassments as they would amount to in a certain sense. This whole, and then there was one more category. I think it had to do with the places where people lived, or maybe possibly places where, I don't know if it's known, and I think it is, that there's a high proportion of illegal immigrants from a few countries like Guatemala. Then you could say, where do all the Guatemalans hang out? And just have your roving patrol always go through there. So again, this is like, I would say by the older legal norm, or I would say almost like if you would go, that's complicated. I want to sort of say the way the federal court found it, it was sort of the normative thing, and it was obvious they were going to find it that way. And then it's sort of like only SCOTUS, because they're more full of their own grandeur, are willing to opine on this in a free way, in a certain sense. But on the other hand, I feel like there's plenty of law professors who would have argued over these issues, even though most of the federal justices would have been very meek about them and kept with the status quo in a certain sense. I guess my conclusion here is sort of like, yes, Trump is de facto controlling the court, and the decisions are all going in favor of ICE and going in favor of these things that really, I don't know that they have that large. That's the other funny thing. I don't know that sort of ICE and immigration beyond sort of paleo-conservatives has that big of a, it wasn't that big a thing in the standard Republican Party, didn't care about it. And I don't even think most of MAGA is that into it. I think it's more coming from the paleo-conservative side of things, and it's sort of a niche thing. I don't think frankly, I'm kind of ignorant of that. I should know that, but exactly how Bannon deals with this. I don't think Bannon is that hot on all these ICE raids, because it has some concern with the Bill of Rights being rightly protecting all citizens. But again, that's sort of a situation where, things are going on the MAGA side and everything, because they have and then the explanation is, yes, they have more justices that they've put in the court, such as Kavanaugh, Gorsuch, and the other conservative justices, which are all siding with this. But then it's just not that obvious, because there were always sort of conservative justices that may have sort of favored these decisions, but now they're just in the majority. And so then you could say, well, it's a position that's independent in some way of Trump, but Trump's just sort of maneuvering within the possibility of this idea. So it's an interesting question to what degree is Trump in control of the courts, and how much is this it's more like positions that already existed are sort of being pushed in ways that mostly these positions are positions which were, I guess, something like if you took a gross split between Constitution Society or more democratic mainstream view in the law schools and Reagan-era Federalist Society, which is sort of more conservative and more sort of mainstream, actually, in a way. I mean, people like Richard Epstein, John Yoo, and so on. These don't really represent the impulse behind the ICE stuff. I would say neither of these parties do, but because it's really a paleo-conservative impulse, but nonetheless they're furthering that aim because they're more willing to give greater executive power, and they're more willing to get the law working with the executive more like in most systems in most of the planet, in fact, I think. I mean, because if you have a parliamentary system or a diet system, then you have not the president created by the election directly, but the president created by the diet or by the by the ruling body. So let me look at this from one other angle quickly. Is that how does this link up sort of to Locke? I was thinking, Locke. We should look more. So let's look more on Locke in connected to how did we get to this excessive Montesquieuian separation of powers system within liberalism. If we understand liberalism, especially through Locke's theory of natural law and Locke's theory of law in general.